There is something almost peaceful about the way the story was first told. Gene Hackman, 95 years old, retired, private, a man who had walked away from one of the most celebrated careers in American film history and, by all public accounts, had simply chosen quiet. Santa Fe, New Mexico, a beautiful estate, a devoted wife, books, mornings without cameras, a life earned and then deliberately enclosed. That was the version of the story the world received, and for a long time it was enough. It fit. It matched the image of the man, the one who had always seemed more interested in craft than in fame, more comfortable in character than in celebrity. When he stopped making films in 2004, nobody called it a breakdown or a scandal. They called it a graceful exit. That framing held for over 20 years. It began to loosen on February 26, 2025, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. An unnamed handyman, someone connected to the property through employment, someone who would have understood the rhythms of the estate well enough to recognize when something had broken, raised an alarm. He had not been able to reach anyone. No one had heard from the couple. The silence had stretched past the point where silence was ordinary. When deputies from the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department arrived at 1425 Old Sunset Trail, they did not find an unlocked door or a cooperative household staff. They forced entry through sealed gates. That detail is worth holding for a moment, not an open gate, not a gate that had been left ajar. Sealed gates, forced open by law enforcement at a property that had been completely unreachable. Inside, they found Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, both dead. The official statement that followed was measured and prompt. Sheriff Adon Mendoza and the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department described the situation as one involving natural causes. No signs of foul play. A routine investigation. The language was clean and efficient, the kind of language designed to answer the loudest questions before they could be asked. 2 elderly people, a private estate, deaths consistent with age and natural decline. There was nothing to see here, and the framing suggested that anyone who looked harder was looking for something that wasn't there. But the scene itself told a different story. Not loudly, not in the way of crime thrillers or dramatic reveals, quietly, in the specific, granular, undeniable language of physical detail. Furniture had been dragged, not rearranged, dragged in the way that suggests something urgent or something forced. Books had been pulled from shelves, not one or two, the way a reader moves through a collection, but pulled, displaced, disrupted in a pattern that does not match any ordinary evening. Drawers were open. The bedroom safe was open, and it was empty. Whatever it had contained, documents, materials, objects of value or significance, was gone. And the internal cameras, the surveillance system of a compound that had been described as operating under 24-hour monitoring, had been disabled. Think about what that last detail means in the context of everything surrounding it. This was not a home that treated security as an afterthought. The estate at 1425 Old Sunset Trail was a $4 million compound set within the dense forest of Santa Fe, New Mexico, a state whose landscape has absorbed more classified history than almost anywhere else in the American West. Los Alamos is 90 minutes away. The Manhattan Project was born in this geography. The Cold War left its architecture, bunkers, installations, facilities built underground and off the record, scattered through this region like seeds. The physical environment of northern New Mexico does not separate easily from its history of concealment. That context matters. It does not explain anything on its own, but it shapes the air around every detail that follows. The estate itself, by the accounts of those who had seen it, operated at a level of security that went far beyond what most private residences, even extremely wealthy ones, maintain. Stone perimeter walls, reinforced gates, motion sensors, thermal cameras, a staff that had been handpicked and vetted. Surveillance that ran continuously, day and night, around a property that its owner had reportedly chosen as his permanent retreat from public life. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an architectural historian at the University of New Mexico, who had documented estates across the Southwest, described it in terms that deserve to be read carefully. I've documented estates all over the Southwest. This one was designed like a museum built as a military compound. She added, the beauty was real, but so were the countermeasures. A museum built as a military compound. That phrase does not describe the home of a retired actor who wanted peace and books in New Mexico mornings. It describes something that was built to look like one thing while functioning as another. Gene Hackman understood that architecture better than most people ever would, not because of what he built, but because of what he spent decades studying. Through the particular and demanding process of inhabiting characters whose lives were organized entirely around the gap between what is visible and what is real. His most enduring roles were not love stories or adventure films. They were explorations of hidden systems. In The French Connection, he played a detective tunneling through the concealed infrastructure of organized crime, finding the architecture of corruption beneath the surface of a city that looked ordinary. In The Conversation, he played a surveillance expert, a man whose entire life was the act of listening to what other people believed was private, a man who ultimately discovered that the machinery of watching cannot protect the watcher. An enemy of the state, he played a former intelligence operative living off the grid, a man who had built his existence around the certainty that visibility was danger. These were not coincidences of casting. They were, across decades, a sustained engagement with a single recurring theme, the truth that lives beneath the surface of things and the cost of knowing it. The world knew the face. The house knew the truth. Hold that thought, because what comes next requires it. The timeline surrounding the deaths is the point where the official framing begins to fracture most visibly. According to what investigators and the coroner's findings suggested, Betsy Arakawa, 65 years old, Gene Hackman's wife, died approximately 1 week before Gene Hackman himself, which means Gene Hackman was, by this account, alive in that house for up to 7 days after his wife's death. 7 days in a $4 million compound with a 24-hour surveillance system and a vetted staff and reinforced gates and thermal cameras. 7 days, and not a single call for help was made. Not to emergency services, not to family, not to staff, not to anyone. There is a version of that detail that is simply tragic. An elderly man, in cognitive or physical decline, unable to process or respond to what had happened. That version exists, and it should be acknowledged. Grief and age and isolation can produce profound helplessness. The absence of a call is not by itself evidence of anything sinister. But the absence of a call exists inside a context. It exists inside a compound with thermal cameras that should have registered a living body and a dead one. It exists inside a property where a vetted staff had regular contact with the household. It exists inside a security architecture that was, according to the testimony of the people who had studied it, not designed for passive monitoring, but for active, continuous awareness of everything occurring within the perimeter. How do you have 24-hour surveillance and not know for 7 days that one of the two people inside is dead? That question does not have a clean answer. and the official framing does not attempt to provide one. What investigators found when they moved deeper into the estate complicated the picture further. The property records for 1425 Old Sunset Trail contained unexplained gaps. Building permits, when they could be located, were either mundane to the point of being uninformative, or incomplete, or partially redacted. The structural footprint of the compound, as far as public documentation could establish it, did not fully account for what appeared to be present. Official statements from the sheriff's department remained vague in ways that are sometimes routine and sometimes are not. The private library was one of the last areas agents entered. Hackman had been known, in the limited public accounts of his retirement, to be a serious reader. His literary life was one of the details that anchored the narrative of his retirement, a man who had traded the noise of Hollywood for the quiet company of books. The library at the estate was reportedly consistent with that image. Substantial, carefully organized, the kind of room that accumulates over decades of genuine engagement with the written word. To enter it was, presumably, to encounter something that confirmed the story that had been told about him. A reader's room. A scholar's room. A room that made sense, except that it did not entirely make sense. Agents moving through the library encountered something that should not have been there if the room was only what it appeared to be. Not a simple bookcase on a hinge, the mechanism for entry was more specific than that, more deliberate, requiring a particular activation sequence rather than the kind of concealed door that appears in architectural novelties in old houses. This was engineered. Someone had designed it with care and with the apparent intention that it would not be found by anyone who did not already know to look. Beyond the mechanism, stone steps descended. The air changed immediately. The temperature dropped. The quality of the air shifted in a way that is specific and unmistakable to anyone who has entered a space that has been sealed from the surface for a long period of time. Damp, metallic, cold, the particular staleness of air that has not moved, has not circulated, has not encountered the outside world in a very long time. The walls of the passage bore markings, inscriptions, symbols, what appeared to be schematics of some kind, evidence that the space had been not just constructed, but used, engaged with, documented in its own private language. This was not a wine cellar. This was not a storm shelter. This was not the kind of space that appears in the building permits of a private estate. Below the library floor, the house stopped being a home. The stone steps descended at a measured angle, not steep enough to be dangerous, not shallow enough to be casual. Someone had thought carefully about this. The grade was deliberate. The width was deliberate. When agents reached the base of the steps and their lights found the walls of the passage ahead, what they encountered was not the rough-hewn earth of a hobbyist project or the crumbling concrete of a Cold War relic left to decay. The tunnel was reinforced, concrete and steel, maintained, current, wide enough that a small vehicle could have moved through it without difficulty. LED lighting ran along the ceiling in a continuous line, dormant now but intact. A ventilation system, state-of-the-art, sat silent in the walls. The air that had greeted them at the top of the steps, damp, metallic, cold, stale, was not the air of a tunnel that had been abandoned. It was the air of a tunnel that had been sealed. There is a difference. Abandonment produces a specific kind of decay. Sealing produces something else, a preserved stillness, a suspended moment, the atmosphere of a place that has been paused rather than forgotten. The walls told part of the story. Markings covered them, inscriptions, symbols, what appeared to be schematics drawn or etched with precision and care. Not graffiti. not the casual notation of construction workers, something more systematic, more intentional. The kind of documentation that belongs to a place with a function that its inhabitants understood deeply and needed to record. Agents moved forward. At approximately 100 feet below the surface of a private estate in Santa Fe, New Mexico, they found a room. It was roughly the size of a basketball court. The ceiling was high enough that it did not press down on the space. Whoever had designed this had understood that the psychology of a room matters as much as its function. Climate-controlled shelving lined every wall, and the shelving was full. What it contained was not what any investigator walking down stone steps into the earth beneath a retired actor's library would have expected to find. Shakespeare folios. Medieval illuminated manuscripts, their colors still vivid under controlled light, their vellum still supple, preserved with the kind of care that institutional conservators spend careers learning to apply. First editions, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and others, arranged with the same meticulous attention to temperature and humidity and light exposure that defines the conservation practices of the world's most serious rare book collections. The estimated value of what occupied those shelves exceeded $100 million. Let that number settle. $100 million in rare literary materials housed in a climate-controlled chamber beneath a private home in the New Mexico desert, accessible only through a concealed mechanism in a private library, reached by stone steps that descended into an air that smelled of metal and cold. This was not a collection assembled casually. It was not the accumulation of a wealthy man indulging a hobby. The preservation infrastructure alone, the shelving systems, the climate control, the structural envelope required to maintain those conditions beneath the earth represented an investment of time and money and expertise that implies something more than personal enthusiasm. It implies purpose. It implies a reason for keeping these things here, underground, invisible, outside the knowledge of any institution or archive or public record. The agents moved deeper. At approximately 200 feet, the tunnel opened into a second chamber. This one was different in character from the first. Where the rare book room had the atmosphere of a library, ordered, still, devoted to the preservation of language, the space at 200 feet had the quality of a working environment. Professional film restoration equipment occupied the center of the room. Humidity-controlled vaults lined the walls alongside temperature-controlled storage units of a kind used by major film archives. Inside those vaults, thousands of film reels. Rare prints from Hollywood's golden age, the kind of material that film historians spend careers tracking through estate sales and studio archives, and the private collections of obsessives who understood decades before the broader culture did that celluloid was mortal. Among the reels were prints that had been presumed lost, unreleased alternate scenes, alternate endings, versions of films that the public had never seen and that no studio had acknowledged retaining. And mixed through the Hollywood material, international films, productions from Eastern Europe, from Asia, from Latin America, cinema from political and cultural environments where preservation had been erratic or actively suppressed, where the destruction of film had sometimes been an act of policy rather than neglect. Someone had been collecting the things that history was in the process of losing. That framing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it begins to change the shape of what this tunnel is. The rare book chamber and the film preservation laboratory taken together do not describe a hoard. They describe a project, a sustained, funded, professionally executed project of cultural preservation operating entirely outside institutional channels, no grants, no board of directors, no public accountability, no record in any archive that the public or the academic community could access. The question of why it had to be underground had not yet been answered. The agents moved deeper still. At approximately 300 feet, the tunnel ended, or rather it opened. The passage gave way to something that had not been engineered from scratch, but converted, a natural cavern, substantial in its dimensions, modified over years of careful work into something that had no straightforward category. The floor had been leveled. The humidity and temperature were controlled through systems built into the rock walls. Hydroponic gardens grew in tiered formations, green and living in the underground light, producing plants that were not decorative and were not food crops in any commercial sense. Adjacent to the gardens, a seed vault, its conceptual architecture modeled on the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Norwegian facility built to preserve the agricultural heritage of the entire planet against catastrophic loss. But where Svalbard was a public institution, visible, internationally known, the subject of diplomatic agreements and scientific papers, this vault had no name that any public record acknowledged. It preserved endangered plant species, plants extinct in the wild, rare botanical material from ecosystems that were under pressure or already partially destroyed. The research laboratories attached to the cavern contained DNA sequencing technology, growth chambers, and genetic data systems oriented toward crop resilience research, the kind of science that addresses not the present but the future, that attempts to solve problems which have not yet fully arrived. Scientists had been working here. That much was apparent from what the labs contained. Those scientists, whoever they were, had been bound by confidentiality agreements so comprehensive that not a single name had surfaced. Not a single paper had been published under conditions that would connect the work to this place. The science had been happening. The results, if there were results, had gone somewhere that was not the public record. Gene Hackman had allegedly described what he was doing in this way: I'm providing resources and freedom for qualified researchers to pursue important work without the usual constraints of grant applications and institutional politics. That statement, if it reflects what he actually believed, describes a man who thought the existing systems for funding and conducting important scientific work were inadequate, too slow, too political, too dependent on institutional approval, and who had decided, with the resources available to him, to build a parallel system, underground, invisible, accountable to no one except the work itself. There is something in that description that is not entirely unfamiliar. The history of science contains figures who operated outside institutional channels and produced things that the institutions later had to account for. It also contains figures who operated outside institutional channels and produced things that warranted the concern they eventually attracted. The absence of oversight does not determine which category applies. It only means that no one outside the project was in a position to know. The silence around this discovery was not accidental. Every worker who had contributed to the construction or maintenance of what lay beneath the estate had signed non-disclosure agreements. The staff, already handpicked, already vetted, already legally bound in ways that went beyond standard employment, had been selected in part for their demonstrated ability to maintain confidentiality. Local journalists who began to pull at the edges of the story after the deaths in February 2025 found themselves encountering walls of silence so consistent and so complete that the silence itself became a data point. A researcher affiliated with the Santa Fe Historical Society began an inquiry into the property's history. At a certain point, that researcher stopped returning calls. The findings were never published. Building permits where they could be located were either too mundane to be informative or incomplete or partially redacted. Property records contain gaps that should not, under ordinary circumstances, have been there. Official statements from the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department remained vague in ways that grew harder to attribute to routine caution as more details emerged. The FBI, once involved, said very little. Marcus Devlin, a structural engineer who reviewed what documentation was available, made a series of statements that have not been contradicted. This wasn't built by the homeowner, he said. He continued, the upper section was renovated, modernized, reinforced, but the core of this tunnel was already here. And then, most precisely, Hackman moved into it. He inherited it. That sequence of 3 statements reframes everything that came before it. If Hackman inherited the tunnel, if the core infrastructure was already present when he acquired the property, if he moved into a house that already contained something beneath its floor, then the question of what he knew and when he knew it becomes far more complicated than the public narrative allowed. Richard Payne, a retired Department of Energy consultant, connected New Mexico's underground infrastructure to the Cold War systems that were built throughout the region during the mid-20th century. Los Alamos is nearby. The Manhattan Project reshaped this land. Government installations of a kind that do not appear in standard public records were constructed throughout the Southwest during decades when the logic of secrecy was considered sufficient justification for almost any action. The possibility that a tunnel beneath a private estate in Santa Fe was once something else, something that predated Gene Hackman's ownership by decades, something that had been built for purposes that were never declassified, is not a fringe speculation in this geography. It is a structurally reasonable hypothesis. Construction activity at the property, by the accounts available, began in a meaningful way around 2007. FBI interests began to develop around 2015. A legal process that lasted nearly 3 years followed. A federal warrant was allegedly issued in late 2018. And then, allegedly, on a cold January morning in 2019, more than 50 federal agents descended on the property at 1425 Old Sunset Trail. 50 agents. For a retired actor's home in Santa Fe. Dr. James Whitfield, a former FBI forensic analyst with 19 years processing classified evidence, offered a reading of the agency's subsequent behavior that carries weight precisely because it comes from inside the institutional logic being described. When an agency goes this quiet, this fast, he said, it means one of 2 things. Either they found nothing and they're embarrassed, or they found something so significant that the disclosure conversation has moved above the investigative team. He paused before adding, this doesn't look like embarrassment. At some point during the investigation, a federal analyst ran the accumulated documentation through an AI analysis system, property records, thermal scans, body camera transcripts, tunnel images. The output, as it was described, did not produce dramatic conclusions. It produced something more unsettling, a series of quiet, precise observations. Residential classification. Inconsistent. Security density exceeds private home baseline. Subsurface void, intentional, multi-phase, and maintained. Document redaction pattern suggests protected network, not isolated homeowner behavior. And then, the observation that lands most heavily when held against everything else, human reputation maintained above ground, while contrary evidence accumulated below ground. The final line of the analysis read as follows: no known closed system remains sealed indefinitely under death, decay, legal intervention, or environmental change. That is not a dramatic statement. It is a systems observation. Closed systems open. The question is always when and under what pressure. If you have sat with this story long enough to feel the weight of what it contains, not the sensation of a scandal, but the quieter and more durable sensation of something genuinely unresolved, then the only honest response is to hold it openly, not to perform certainty in either direction. not to decide that Gene Hackman was a hero of preservation or a figure of concealment before the evidence fully permits that judgment, to stay with the question. That is the only intellectually honest place to stand when a story like this one refuses to close. If that kind of sustained, careful thinking matters to you, if you believe that questions like this one deserve more than a headline, then staying with this channel is one quiet way to say so. The FBI found nothing illegal. That sentence requires the same careful attention as every other sentence in this story because of what it does and does not mean. It means that the investigation, after years of legal process and a search operation that deployed more than 50 agents, did not produce criminal charges, did not result in prosecution, did not find evidence of activity that the law, as currently written, defines as unlawful. It does not mean the investigation found nothing. It means that what it found did not fit the category the agency had apparently anticipated. The Smithsonian Institution, according to accounts that emerged in the aftermath, expressed interest in housing portions of the collections. Film historians, environmental scientists, botanists, and literary scholars who became aware of what the tunnel contained responded not with alarm, but with something closer to reverence. The work that had been conducted in those underground laboratories, the genetics research, the seed preservation, the crop resilient science was, by the assessments of people qualified to evaluate it, serious, important, the kind of work that warranted exactly the resources and freedom that Hackman had allegedly described providing. The scandal the public had been prepared to receive did not materialize. What materialized instead was harder to categorize and, in some ways, harder to process. A man of enormous wealth and extraordinary discipline had spent years, perhaps decades, quietly funding and protecting work that he believed mattered in a manner so complete and so sealed that not a single detail had surfaced publicly before his death. The cultural materials preserved in those chambers, the books, the manuscripts, the films, had been saved from the ordinary processes of loss and neglect and institutional failure that claim most things eventually. The science conducted in the cavern 300 feet below his library had advanced questions that the surface world was only beginning to take seriously. The question of what keeps a man silent for 7 days in a house with a dead loved one has not been answered. It may never be answered cleanly, but it exists now inside a different frame than it did at the beginning of this story, inside the frame of a man who had built his entire life, the visible life and the invisible one, around the discipline of silence, around the conviction that what mattered most should be protected most completely. And then there is the iron door. At the far end of the tunnel, beyond the rare book chamber, beyond the film laboratory, beyond the underground cavern with its living gardens and its preserved seeds, agents encountered a door. Iron. Heavy. It had no exterior handle. It had no visible hinges. Its seams were welded, rust gathering along the welds in a way that suggested the door had been in place for a very long time. The rivets were set deep. The surface bore the particular quality of metal that has been sealed with intention rather than closed in haste. Every seam welded, every edge sealed. It had the appearance, agents noted, of something sealed from the inside. The FBI has said nothing publicly about what lies beyond it. No statement, no acknowledgement, no indication of whether the door was opened, whether it could be opened, whether what it conceals was examined or remains, as of this moment, untouched. The house at 1425 Old Sunset Trail outlived the man who lived in it. The secret outlived the house. and somewhere beneath the floor of a private library in Santa Fe, New Mexico, behind an iron door with no exterior handle and welds along every seam, something is either waiting to be found or has already been found and chosen by those who found it to remain unspoken. Was Gene Hackman the last guardian of something buried long before he was born, or was he its final prisoner? The door does not have an outside handle. Whoever closed it last was standing on the other side.